Hi, and welcome to our Pop Culture Pedagogy Roundtable for Wayne Pop 2021, our virtual conference. My name is Shelby Cadwell, and I'm going to be moderating this session. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I wanted to give a little bit of information about myself and my background before I allow my collaborators to introduce themselves as well. I am a graduate student at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, working on my PhD in English with a focus in film and media studies. My research area is specifically broadly it's pop culture, and then a little bit more narrowed in science fiction, Afrofuturism, Black feminist theories of the human, eco-criticism, environmental studies, across a wide range of media. So I think very broadly am a pop culture scholar, in the broadest sense of the term, and I look at a lot of pop culture. I have taught at Wayne State University, Oakland Community College, the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, and I've also taught for Florida Atlantic University online. I have taught classes ranging from composition to African American literature, short stories and novels. I've taught a lot of media classes, including classes on comics, video games, film theory, film criticism, film history, and I'm currently also teaching a class on gender and television, which is very exciting. So I'd like to ask my collaborators to introduce themselves. If you could give us your name, a little bit of your background as far as your research interest goes, and then where you're teaching and what you're teaching, either what you're teaching currently or what you've taught that you'd like to kind of share with us. So I'm just going to go across my screen. So I will start with Julia. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Largent. My pronouns are she, her. I'm assistant professor of communication at McPherson College, which is in Kansas. I originate from Indiana, and I did my PhD at Bowling Green State University. And I'm involved with Midwest Pop Culture Association. I think that's how Shelby and I really know each other. I research primarily documentaries and fan studies. I also like to merge the two fields when I can and talk about documentary fans, but that's not that often. It's not a very big field in that sense. I teach courses primarily on the media side of media and communication, but I do teach our public speaking classes, as does every person in the field of communication. But I also teach our pop culture and research methods course. When I started here a couple of years ago, I was invited to create a pop culture course of whatever I wanted to do with it. And we didn't have a research methods class either. And so I kind of took the two and merged them together. And so I've developed it as a class where every 2 years is a different topic. And so that's one of the locations or the classes that I use most frequently, a pop culture, obviously, but I like to sprinkle it in a bunch of other classes as well, making them watch simple Adam Savage videos, his TED Talk about cosplay, and outline it. So I try and sprinkle in fandom and pop culture where I can.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Julia. Next on my screen is Grace.
Hello, I'm Grace Wagner. I use they, them pronouns. I just graduated with my MFA in poetry from the University of Houston, and I got a certificate in women, gender, and sexuality studies. My scholarly focuses at the University of Houston were Anglo-Saxon poetry, eco-criticism, and science fiction, particularly feminist science fiction. I have a love for Afrofuturism, particularly Octavia Butler. She was who I first presented at a conference on. A little about me. My manuscript, The Gift Shop at the End of the World, is a work of eco-confessionalism that tracks recent extinctions and has a healthy dose of post-apocalyptic sensibilities. I've taught for the community nonprofit Imprint, and I've also taught for the University of Houston, where I taught Introduction to Fiction, a literature course where I use science fiction as sort of the backbone of the course. English composition, where we used a variety of pop culture resources, as well as a creative writing class, Introduction to Poetry. And pop culture definitely played a part even in the workshop, because we would have prompts, and we watched a lot of slam, we watched a lot of contemporary poetry. So I think pop culture has been an important part of my pedagogy from the beginning.
Okay, thank you so much, Grace. And last but not least, our fourth presenter on this roundtable, Margaret.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret Robins. I got my PhD recently in language and literacy education at the University of Georgia, and I focused on comics and young adult literature and also writing pedagogy. And my dissertation work involved studying fan communities and book clubs, particularly those that focused on empowered female protagonists, including female protagonists of color. So a lot of my teaching and my scholarship has centered around studying comics and young adult literature, and also studying pop culture texts such as fan fiction and comics, and better utilizing them in classroom settings. And I have mainly taught in K-12 settings. I'm currently at the Mount Vernon School in Atlanta, Georgia. I also did some college teaching at the University of Georgia, specifically a young adult literature course and also a methods course. And I mentored student teachers in the English ed department. And I actually have a little bit of a creative writing background as well. I got a creative writing certificate at Kennesaw State University, focused on creative nonfiction, but I'm beginning to dabble a little bit in picture book writing and young adult literature writing. And I have a mentor through SCBWI. And most of my publications thus far have been in pedagogical journals, such as the Allen Review and the Signal Journal. So a lot of what I put into practice as well involves fan fiction and comics and studying pop culture texts from a critical literacy standpoint. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you everyone so much for introducing yourselves. I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about the Wayne Pop 2021 conference and the theme, to just sort of remind us like what the conversation is part of more broadly. So Wayne Pop 2021, it's our 7th annual pop culture conference hosted and organized primarily by grad students from Wayne State University. We also have some grad students from Bowling Green State University who are helping us organize the conference this year. So very excited to see representation from their amazing pop culture and American studies culture, or their American studies programs. So the theme for this year's conference is disruptions, gaps, transitions, and leaps. And originally that theme came about because we were planning yet another virtual conference in the middle of a continuing pandemic. So we started to think about how disruptions and gaps and transitions and leaps affect kind of pop culture scholarship, how they affect pop culture texts. So texts about disruptions and gaps, archiving, how archiving fills in gaps or can create gaps, how significant transitions in technology or in sort of like socio-political circumstances can affect how we both like read and create pop culture texts, and then how we sort of experience these significant leaps in how we kind of understand and deal with pop culture text. So I think that in the past like 18-ish months or so, we have all been dealing with a lot of disruptions and gaps and transitions and leaps. And some of them have been great things and most of them have been terrible things. But I really want to think about how the pandemic and how online teaching have affected our pedagogy as pop culture researchers and as teachers more broadly. I know a lot of us have taught classes outside of like just pop culture studies as kind of a specific thing. But like I think most of us have said, we bring pop culture to everything we do, whether it's our creative process or our teaching or both of those things or all of those things. So I wanted to start with a question, which is, in the sort of like current teaching environment or the teaching environment for the past, year and a half or so, especially in online teaching settings, how did you see your pedagogy kind of changing or adapting to this new kind of way of this new way of communicating with students? And were you able to kind of continue making pop culture part of your courses when you shifted to an online environment? or were you able to maybe like include more things, dig into things in different ways? So I'll kind of just leave that question open, and whoever wants to jump in can jump in. But basically, how has the last year and a half of online teaching, emergency remote learning affected your pop culture pedagogy?
I can start because my online teaching was actually for a fairly brief period of time. I was teaching 7th graders online from March until the end of May of 2020. And then for the most part, we have been back in person. But fortunately, I was able to move forward with my original plan of teaching Miss Marvel No Normal by G. Willow Wilson. And I will say that there was the added challenge, of course, of not being there in person with the students. So it was harder to show them the pictures that I wanted to discuss more broadly. And in particular with that comic, there's so much subtle humor there on the part of the artist in addition to the writer. And I do think a little bit of that nuance got lost in the online setting. However, and I would have live online teaching sessions that I would also record in case a student was unable to be there. But we would read the text out loud and they would be following along with the pictures. And so I was still able to incorporate that practice, and we were able to discuss at the end. So that part of it, we were able to continue. And I also had some online discussion boards where we could go into more depth with it. So I don't think it drastically affected my teaching of the novel, honestly. But I do think a little bit of the visual humor nuance got lost in the shuffle. That being said, I actually did a follow-up fan fiction writing assignment after teaching the novel, because there's a part of the book where she talks about writing fan fiction and her connection to the original Captain Marvel and the Avengers. And through that process, I was able to have extended conferences with the students that lasted about 10, even 15 minutes, where I met online with the student and also with one of their peers. And honestly, that's harder to do in a more traditional classroom setting. So I actually felt like that was a rich experience that I had with the students that sometimes in-person teaching doesn't allow, at least for as long of a period of time. So I felt like that was actually an advantage of online teaching in my context.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I agree that it didn't necessarily change what I taught. My pedagogy in terms of content was pretty much the same. I've taught 2 semesters online last fall and last spring, 3 different classes. All of them had unique challenges and unique benefits from moving online. I will say that moving online actually made me much more aware of accessibility, and not just accessibility in terms of like multimodal content, but also in terms of internet access and technology availability, or whether someone has a quiet space, right? So I think discussion was a little more difficult in the online setting, but I made it very clear to my students, like, if you need to have your camera off, but you can still speak, that's great. If you can have your camera on, but you're uncomfortable speaking, put it in the chat. And I must say, I really like the chat function of Zoom, because when I'm speaking, they can put in a question and I can answer it seamlessly, or they can add a comment when one of their peers is speaking, and we can go back and forth with that chat. I think moving to Zoom actually sort of, in some way, turned the classroom into this like sci-fi experience, right? Like it's now fully virtual. It's a digital experience. My creative writing students never met in person, but we were still able to sort of develop these close relationships needed for discussion, and particularly for critique. In terms of being able to share pop culture content, it was actually in some ways easier as long as everyone's internet was operating functionally, right? So because with Zoom, you have the option to optimize it for video and sound. So when I shared videos, we could have an immersive experience together and then stop it and discuss. And that was actually really useful. In some ways, that was better because I could also post links to those videos for them to review later. So like if someone's internet dropped, they wouldn't miss everything, right? And so again, there were challenges. There were challenges in terms of the creative writing exercises that I gave to my fiction class, because what we did in fiction classes each week was an element like plot, point of view, character setting, et cetera, et cetera. And then they would do a creative writing exercise where they try to implement what they've learned about that element of fiction. And that was a little bit harder to give feedback on, because previously in in-person classes, I give handwritten feedback. And I feel my students respond they're much more likely to read it if I write it, in pink ink on their paper than if I just add a comment on a Word doc or something like that. So I do think that lack of feedback affected some of their potential in terms of the creative writing exercises, but they still surprised me and were still engaged and still cared about the class. And I think that teaching the pop culture text, like for example, we did Binti, the novella that won the Hugo and the Nebula by Nnedi Okorafor. We did Binti, we did The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and compared it to the first episode of the show. And we also did Slaughterhouse-5 and incorporated YouTube critiques and things about Slaughterhouse-5. And so I agree with Margaret that it didn't really affect my pedagogy. It was more challenging in terms of delivery than what I was used to, because again, we weren't given much training or support to be suddenly online. But my students always surprised me, and they did an excellent job. And I have at the end of the day, it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I'll just echo what both of you said. The one difficulty that I had, it wasn't so much showing the clips or incorporating, what I normally would have done in class. Where I came into kind of a wall was when I would originally show like an entire episode of something over Zoom. One, I felt uncomfortable because of the copyright issue, because I was recording, even I didn't want to even, get Disney on me. But also the internet aspect. At the time I just moved, and the very beginning of class, it was a January class. So it was 3 hours each day for 3.5 or so weeks. And I kept having my internet crap out on me. And so I was really cautious of the length of video that I was showing. So for the most part, that didn't affect my class. But it did mean that I couldn't show an episode that I had planned to show. And I had to kind of scramble to figure out what to do instead, because I've been doing the same activity for a specific class for semester after semester. So that's what I've experienced in terms of how it changed anything. But I'll agree, the ability for the Zoom chat was great, as well as, I didn't have issues showing smaller or shorter clips. So I echo the same.
I think like one thing for me that's been I think a benefit to the sort of shift to emergency, I would like to call it emergency remote learning, because I know that online teaching is like a whole field, and there are people that specialize in that, and there's all of this like amazing pedagogy and research in it. And what we were doing was probably not so much that, because no one really had the training or the time to do that. So emergency remote learning, and then hopefully after we had more sort of resources in place, then we could maybe call it online teaching. But I've had the opportunity to teach at like Florida Atlantic University, and I'm based in Detroit, Michigan. So I've actually had the opportunity to teach online and teach pop culture classes that I would have never been able to teach because they needed online instructors, and they were willing to look pretty far afield because they didn't need someone who was in Boca Raton. They could look anywhere. So that's one thing that's personally been a benefit to me. I think that, like everyone else's experiences, there have been some benefits, but there have also been some drawbacks. And I think that accessibility we've all kind of brought up that accessibility is a thing that we have to keep in mind when we're teaching online, because our students don't have equal access to just internet, right? To Wi-Fi or wired internet or a hotspot. The other thing, and I think, you brought this up, Julia, too, with the issue of copyright, is that there are certain things that we might want to show as pop culture texts, where if you're in a classroom and you can log into your own account for whatever thing it is and stream an episode of, for example, WandaVision, right? You can only get WandaVision on Disney Plus. I want to show my gender and television students episodes of WandaVision because I think it's a very fascinating show in terms of what it does with the intersection of gender and genre. Right? So like, how does it take the family sitcom and sort of recreate it in a way, but also kind of complicate and problematize like the gender roles. But because it's on Disney Plus, because I can't just pull it up on a screen and show it with my own Disney Plus account that I pay for, and because I don't want every single student to have to spend $9 to have an account on Disney Plus, there's an access issue here. And the way that I've dealt with some of that is I've encouraged students to go in on accounts together. I've chosen things that are easily streamable across multiple platforms. I've found things that are available on YouTube or Vimeo. I've tried to do a lot of different things to make sure that pop culture texts are accessible to my students. One thing I did last summer is I was teaching an introduction to film class fully online, and I was using all Black filmmakers that semester. So I had 1 month at the end of the semester where I had all of the screenings were things that were available on Hulu, but I kind of put them all together in one part of the syllabus so that someone could get a free trial. And if they didn't want to pay for Hulu, and that everything would be streamable within that free trial period, that it would all be in the same 3-4 weeks of the semester. So like I've had to kind of do some really weird finagling with schedules, with like what I'm assigning to make sure that things are accessible. I guess my question here more broadly is like, what sort of accessibility issues have you run into beyond just the base level accessibility of, do people have internet access that is consistent? And how have you handled accessibility issues, or in what ways do you think you still need to kind of work on accessibility issues in these online spaces now that we're still kind of, at least some of the time, teaching online for a lot of us?
I can start. Our students, we have a mixture. I'm in a private liberal arts. And so we have a mixture of students who can afford to attend and therefore can usually afford technology, but we also have a ton of athletic scholarships. Over 50% of our students are athletes, and so then that comes with it students who probably wouldn't normally been able to attend a liberal arts institution and therefore don't have the funds for a laptop or a tablet. And this is even something before COVID I was very cognizant of in classroom activities. I never made something required that they had to have a computer in the classroom. I would always do computer activities in groups. So if you don't have a laptop, as long as someone in the group in the class does, you're okay, you can still participate. And that's how I operate anyway. And I became even more aware of that, especially in spring 2020, when it was the emergency, we went online. We're not an institution where we have online classes. We are entirely face-to-face. And so the students aren't even expected to have any of that stuff. And so we're also very small. We're about 800 students. And so our computer service is actually loaned out computers and Wi-Fi cards. And, if they needed something, we tried our best to take care of it. And the CARES Act grant helped a lot last year as well, where students were able to get money toward a laptop. And that was fantastic. However, not everyone took advantage. The money ran out, all of those issues that came with it. And so I've only taught purposefully one class online, fully online, and that was last January. It was a public speaking class. And they knew when they took it that it was going to be online. And even then, the requirements to take the class was they had to have a camera and they had to have audio. I didn't require them to turn in really anything that required anything else. They could do things on Google and then download it and then send it to me. A lot of our students were also on campus at that point too, so they were able to hop over to the library if they needed to. And so it's just something that, because I was already thinking and aware of our technology issues going into it, for me, it was a really easy transition, but it was something to consider, especially in spring 2020. I majorly changed everything for my classes, where if they only had a smartphone, they could do everything they needed to do for class, which meant majorly changing what I had originally planned. Including, if they needed to, they had to write out like a 7-page research paper on a phone, which would have sucked, but it could have been done. And so really thinking through, and even though, as we've been fully face-to-face for the most part, same as Margaret, for the last year and a half or so. And at the beginning of every semester, this semester was maybe the loosest I got with planning for going online, but last year, I know both semesters, the way I planned my class was, if we have to go online, I don't have to change a whole lot. And this was very intentional in how I designed each class. And then this year I actually pulled back out like fall 2019 stuff before COVID. And I'm very cautious, but I'm also hopeful that we can stay in person and continue with that. But technology is always an issue for us here. It was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, Julia, I think some of our experiences parallel each other, actually. For me, the access issue in some ways was a little bit different, though. I teach at a private school in Atlanta, so all of my students are issued iPads. So while there were occasionally issues with being able to find internet access, probably less so than some institutions. However, one of the books that I taught during spring 2020, when we were all doing emergency remote learning, I think that's a good term for it, Shelby. There was a book that my students unfortunately had not been given yet, because I didn't foresee what was going to happen. It was called Dreambender by Ronald Kidd. And I really wanted to teach it, but unfortunately there wasn't any kind of availability of it online except for the first 3 chapters. And because of the copyright issues that you all have already mentioned, I decided I didn't want to take any chances. So instead, I excerpted Dreambender and talked about dystopian literature as a genre. And then we actually read some of Ray Bradbury's short stories. And a lot of them have a science fiction background to them, and a lot of them have a dystopian tone to them, at least to a certain degree. So in context of what was happening in the world, it actually seemed very appropriate. And I also had to change our final project at the last minute. I had actually wanted them to do like a mini con, so to say. My plan, if we had been able to stay in person, was to have them create a popular culture convention with activities and speakers and even access to fan fiction texts. And of course, unfortunately, even this past year, I decided that it just wasn't safe to do it. So instead, I actually had my students create online science fiction stories using different digital storytelling techniques. And while it was a little bit of a pivot, I had done a similar project before, only not with the science fiction genre. But for the most part, the students had a lot of fun with it and came up with some really good stories. And the Ray Bradbury text proved to be good mentor texts. So while it wasn't my original plan, I actually think it went well, and it led to some good discussions about privacy and the benefits and drawbacks of technology. And one of the stories we did was The Pedestrian by Ray Bradbury. And it was interesting to do that story in spring 2020, where the focus was more on privacy issues and quarantining and government control. And then teaching that story again in spring 2021, the conversation actually turned more into he was being profiled by a police officer, and in context of what had happened the previous summer, that changed the course of the conversation. And we actually referenced The Falcon and the Winter Soldier and one of the key episodes of that series on Disney Plus. So it was interesting to teach the story once in spring 2020 online, and then in spring 2021 in person. And even though, teaching the same science fiction story twice, the world events definitely changed the conversation. But I was glad I made the change both times, and the students responded well and adjusted well to it.
I will say that I think my teaching experience is probably quite different from both of y'all's, because the University of Houston is a state-run university. It's a state institution. It's in the most diverse big city besides New York in the country. The most diverse county is actually Sugar Land, which is where a lot of my students came from. So we had students from a very wide range of backgrounds with extremes on both ends and everyone in the middle. So it was very interesting when we went online in spring of 2020, because some of my students just immediately dropped and I never heard from them again. And I don't know if it's because they didn't have the technology. I've reached out to them in every way that I had possible. And so a couple of them just disappeared into the ether, you know. But most of my students went to an extraordinary effort to have the space to have class, to be in a quiet space where they could be present, fully present. They made like it was at the beginning of spring 2020. It was difficult, and it was the discussion was easier than the next semester because they already had a rapport from being in person. So that part was fine, but getting everybody on the same page in terms of technology was quite difficult because U of H didn't have the same ability to give everybody iPads and things. It's a giant school. There's a lot of political reasons to how they spend their money, but I will say, actually, the single accessibility issue that had the most profound impact on me and my pedagogy was actually the issue of trauma. A lot of my students experienced significant trauma during the pandemic, and it included everything from family members dying to being sick themselves to losing their job, including several who ended up losing financial aid because they weren't able to maintain their grades in the face of personal trauma, you know? And so I had to become, I feel like I already tried to be trauma aware in my class, but it became a much more present issue over the course of the pandemic. And it was especially evident in my introduction to fiction class. It was especially evident in my creative writing class, because those things would come out in their writing assignments. You could see their anxieties reflected in their creative work. And I think that is one of the reasons why when I offer the creative assignment for the final in my introduction to fiction class, because it is not a workshop environment, I require that they ask permission to do the creative final. And in order to get permission, they must provide a previous example of writing. And that can include the exercises they do in class. It can include fan fiction posts, anything that's narrative, to show that they have a basic level of competency for writing a short story, for example. And I had more students want to do the creative writing final in the online class than I did in any of my in-person introduction to fiction classes, which I found really interesting. And a lot of them used it to create, as you were saying, these dystopian sensibilities, these dystopian worlds, or near future post-apocalyptic worlds. And I thought it was really interesting that sort of the theme of their writing changed, and they responded very well. We also did a Ray Bradbury story. We did There Will Come Soft Rains, because good nuclear apocalypse story. And it was on genre. So we were talking about how it either fit or defied the genre it was in. And we also read Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler, which is about a pandemic that causes physical and intellectual disabilities. And it's about a woman navigating that world, which had a much more profound impact on my 2020 classes than it had in 2019. In 2019, it was like this fun, theoretical, oh, that's so interesting. And now it's like, wow, this is like too real. And some of my students definitely had a much stronger emotional response to that story than they had previously. So I just think it's really important in times of collective trauma to acknowledge it in the classroom, because when I have been in the classroom and there's been a trauma that has not been acknowledged, it becomes this, it makes this space feel less safe, right? So when you acknowledge, hey, we're all going through a lot, we're all just doing our best. I really relaxed my late policy during the pandemic. I basically was like, if you do the work, you'll get the grade. Just send it to me as soon as you can. And because of my scheduling, I was able to manage sort of the late work that piled up, and that wasn't a big deal for me. So it was manageable. And I think that actually took a lot of weight off of my students, because I made it very clear from day one, hey, I am here if you need help navigating disability services or the counseling center. I was very, and have always been very adamant about advocacy for mental health. And during a time like this, it became particularly important. And I think openly acknowledging that in the classroom made my students feel safer talking to me about other things, you know? So I think that was honestly the biggest accessibility issue, is this issue of trauma.
Yeah, I think that I would love to do another roundtable on trauma-informed pop culture pedagogy, because I think that, like, we're talking about like teaching these texts that are like particularly poignant right now. But I think there's like a whole conversation that could be had about, like, you know, do you want to sort of center your class on pop culture texts that deal with trauma? Is there the possibility of re-traumatizing students if you focus too much on it? But if you don't talk about it at all, there's the possibility of creating this like feeling of an unsafe space because it's just not acknowledged. So how do we like safely with our students navigate this trauma, and navigate that sometimes these pop culture texts can also be sort of traumatic or traumatizing because they're dealing with, you know, issues that we're facing in the real world right now. It's the same reason why I have not read any pandemic or plague literature in the last year and a half, because I personally am just like feel overwhelmed by it. So thinking about like how, like what a trauma-informed pop culture pedagogy would look like, I think is a really fascinating question that unfortunately we will not have time to probably dig into more detail and depth today, but I would love to talk about it more in the future. But I think, Grace, yes, absolutely, like dealing with the collective trauma that we're experiencing right now is necessary. I don't think there's any way around it. I think that it's healthy to like acknowledge it. I try my best to do that in my classes. Because we have limited time left and I want to respect everyone's time, I did want to end with a slightly more fun question, I guess, which is what is your favorite pop culture related assignment or project you've ever given in a class? And it can be your favorite just because you really love it and it was your baby and you spent a lot of time creating it, or because it got the best results from students, or whatever reason. But I want to know, like, what have you taught as a pop culture sort of related assignment or project that you were particularly proud of or really enjoyed doing? I will start with my own, which is I taught a film history class online, fully online. And in lieu of a midterm exam and a final exam, I had them do a group project. And one group project was a film festival, of like a sort of speculative film festival on a particular film movement. So I had a group that did noir, I had a group that did French New Wave, I had a group that did Italian neorealism, and they had to kind of put together a film festival, write about the context of the film movement, explain why they chose the films that they chose. They put together like these really cool trailers and brochures. And then for the final exam in that class, I had them sort of pitch a remake of a film from a particular era and discuss the sociopolitical context and historical context of the original film, and then how they would update it for the pandemic era. like, how would you remake this film in 2020? And that was like a really fascinating experience. And it was so much better than grading exams. So I was really proud of those 2 assignments, and I was very happy with the results. One of my groups did a 2020 reboot of Jaws, where Jaws was taken out by the Avengers, which I thought was hilarious, and I loved it. It was really wonderful. So I'm curious, what sort of pop culture assignments have you had a lot of success with?
I can start. I'm actually assigning it tomorrow. It's ironically enough, it's not in my pop culture class. It is actually in a class called editing, and it's about AP style. It's journalism editing, not video editing. It's confusing. And one of our student learning objectives are focused on obviously AP and grammar, AP style and grammar, but also on page layout. And so when I started, I was trying to think of like a project they could do with page layout. You know, part of the process is we learn InDesign, and okay, so what can they do to use it? So I developed this idea where they have to make a fan newsletter. Not quite a zine. It's completely done on the computer, so it's not as cool and fun as a zine might be, but it kind of hints at that. And so using their skills, they have to write everything themselves. They have to use AP style. They have to edit everything. They have to design everything in InDesign they can't use a template. And they're getting together in groups of 2 to 3 to create these newsletters around something that is what a fanish interest of theirs. And for them, it's enough different from what the course material is focused on. You know, grammar can be really obnoxious to learn at 9:30 in the morning. It used to be 8 a.m., so at least it knocked down a tiny bit. And it's also enough different from anything they've done in other classes that for them having, I think, something that's fanish, they can really dive in on, you know, Parks and Rec or Shameless or Marvel or something that they love, and they can kind of nerd out about with 2 or so other students in the class. And that's their final project. And so they go throughout the semester, there's different assignments throughout, and then they'll do the newsletter, a presentation, a reflection paper, all due at the time of their final. So they don't have a final exam in the class. And so that is their final project. And I think it's just a fun way to really think and utilize grammar and AP style and layout all in one assignment. So that's my favorite thing. Hopefully they like it too. And I'm assigning it tomorrow, so it's kind of good timing.
Awesome. Well, I'm doing something new as well shortly. It's actually a combination of an assignment I've done in the past and an assignment that my colleagues and I are doing together. Our students just finished reading Harbor Me by Jacqueline Woodson. And at the end of the book, the characters were talking about, if you were a superhero, who would you be? And also, what are your superpowers? And we're actually about to start a novel, Class Act, a graphic novel, Class Act by Jerry Craft. And one of the main characters of the book, who was also in the first book, the predecessor to this book, New Kid, is really big into drawing comics and loves superhero comics. So an idea that my colleagues and I have had that we wanted to try last year, but it just didn't work out, was to have the students create their own superhero based on some of their own qualities and also the qualities of their favorite superheroes. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to have them create their own superhero figure. And I'm also hoping to have them write a fan fiction story or a narrative story about this superhero figure that they've created. And of course, given that it's their own story rather than a story that they're writing based on other characters in the world, it's technically not fan fiction, but it still gives me a chance to teach them the genre and to bring in some Marvel fan fiction or other superhero fan fiction stories as mentor texts. So it's the first time I've done this assignment as a whole, but I'm looking forward to seeing how the students respond to it.
This is a really interesting question for me because I'm not sure that any one of my assignments is like pure pop culture, but the one that comes to mind right away is when I assigned persona poems in my creative writing class. And that's always really interesting because you get everything from like kind of vague what individuals that may just be a different like job or identity than the person who's writing it. And then you get like these very specific, I am writing in the voice of Wonder Woman, or I am writing in the voice of Steven Universe, you know, sort of poems. And I really enjoy that, because I think a lot of the time people think poetry is nonfiction because it's, you know, it's shelved by the Dewey Decimal System in nonfiction, but that doesn't mean it's autobiographical. And I get a lot of students who have very rigid ideas of what poetry is and can be. And part of what I do is show them you can incorporate pop culture terms, you can change, you can use a form that mimics social media, you can do all kinds of really interesting things with poetry that still can be contemporary and can be modern and can be interesting to the Gen Zs that I teach, right? So I think the persona poem in particular encourages them to sort of explore that realm of fan fiction, but through poetry. And it encourages them to really sort of get into the character development, like of that, whatever person they've chosen. And so I think one of the most moving poems in my class was written in the voice of Wonder Woman. And it was about her struggle with her own physical disability. About the writer's struggle with her own physical disability mirrored against the voice of Wonder Woman. And it was just really fascinating. And I think encouraging hybridity is one of my favorite things to do in both my fiction and my poetry classes, because I think that's where the most interesting creative work is happening now, is on these borders, right? Is in these borderlands, is in these in-between liminal spaces between genre. And I think that that's opening up the world of writing to things like science. Like I recently had a series of science fiction poems published, and I don't think that there would have been an audience for that necessarily previously. I think that that's a new and developing trend. And I can think of, like, there's an amazing post-apocalyptic book of poems called For Tamara by Sarah Lang, I believe. It's either Lang or Long. I'm really bad at names and I apologize for that. But it's a series of fragment poems that are written to a daughter in a post-apocalyptic time. So they're written as, like, some of them are very practical advice, like viruses can be killed with bleach, right? You can eat onions to not get scurvy, and very practical advice. And then it's like mixed with very emotional, heartfelt life lessons. And the fragmented nature of it is also really cool on a formal level. So I just think that when I'm able to bring in the hybridity and incorporate pop culture that way with something literary or something poetic, and then I can really sort of expand the horizon of what my students are capable of imagining. And it's exciting for me, because then I get to see the product of this expansion. So that's probably my favorite assignment.
Thank you all so much. All of these assignments sound amazing, and I want to sign up for all of your classes because they sound great. And as a student, I would take all of these classes. They all sound wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for your time. That's about what we have for today. I do think that a trauma-informed pop culture pedagogy roundtable is in our futures. I am going to send out a call and invite people to join me for that. I think that that would be a wonderful follow-up to the conversation we had today. Thank you all so much for being part of this. I really genuinely appreciate it. This will be published on the YouTube channel for the Wayne Pop conference, which is just, it's called Wayne Pop on YouTube. It's pretty easy to find. I will make sure everyone gets a copy of it. But thank you so much for joining me today for this roundtable. I really appreciate your time and your insights, and look forward to another invite to do this again sometime soon.
Thank you,
Thanks for having
Shelby.
us, Shelby.
Wonderful.
This is wonderful.
Yeah, this was a great opportunity. Thank you for it. And I feel like I learned from each of you. It was a great conversation.
Yes, same. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you so much for your time. And yeah, I'll be back in touch soon.
Thank you.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.
All right. Bye.